two, one, and you are live.
Hello, everybody. My name is Mean Man. I have hands. Today, in Endgame, we're going to be talking about history and the communication of said history. It's going to be very fascinating, so you better listen, okay? And now I give it to these two. Wow.
Oh man. Okay. Well, thank you, Mean Man. I think
Thank
he's
you.
in a mood tonight. It's because he's got VR for the first time. It happens to us all. Hi, welcome to Endgame. So tonight I am joined by Eve, who is our guest host tonight. We're going to be talking about the history of communication. Communication tools. Just a note, if you can't see the slides, unfortunately you'll have to leave the world and come back. There's a bug that makes them be pure white, but there is an image up here. So if you can't see it, that's what you'll have to do. We thought this was a interesting topic to talk about because it's something that we're all pretty deeply involved in. I think the tools that we use for communication. VR is, of course, a new tool that we use for communication, but we use it in a very kind of traditional way. It's we're standing here in proximity to each other, like face to face, talking with each other. Well, I mean, most of us. Some of us are in desktop, which is okay too. But
That's true.
you know, and
Guilty as
there's a few
charged.
different there's a few different ways to do it though, and so. Our first slide here is just kind of a timeline of kind of what our history has been for communication, because the way we talk to each other, the way we interact with each other and convey information changes over time. And so like way back in 30,000 BC, we didn't have written language. We weren't able to put words down in a way that could be transmitted to others. We just had images, and so cave paintings. And then I guess they completely skipped the invention of the written alphabet, and they just went straight to carrier pigeons. I didn't make this timeline, but we stole it from somewhere. We probably should credit it. We'll do that on the YouTube video. So you know, we've used carrier pigeons to send messages to each other. We've used people to send messages to each other. And then at some point we picked up the printing press, and we were able to mass produce language, and then we got the telegraph, and we were able to do it electrically and do it quicker, and then the telephone, and even quicker, and then radio signals, and we were able to have a one-to-many message broadcast, and same with the television, then with images, and then with the internet, and then everything exploded, and you know, here we are now. Yeah, so Eve, you were kind of interested in talking about the ways that, or like how the ways we talk to each other changes what we say to each other, right?
That's right. It's sort of thinking about the platforms of communication and how they affect what we say. So here we are in VR, and you know, would this be different if we were using a different platform, if we were in the same room with each other, or if we were on the telephone, or if we were texting? And each one of those has kind of defines the way you're going to communicate. And I think there are differences between each of the platforms and what it brings out in us and the way that we talk to each other. So that's something that might be good to explore with people if they have any thoughts about that.
Yeah. Okay, so our next slide, this is prehistoric art. So the term prehistoric actually does refer to the time before written language, because when you can write things down, you have a history. So before we could write anything down, it's prehistory. It's pre any real documentation. So what we had, you know, tens of thousands of years ago, sometimes even older than that, is different kinds of art. So image art and sculpture, and I mean, this seems like a good example, right, of when, I mean, what they said to each other was or like, how do we decipher what they said to each other? Because what we have here is, this is a cool piece of art.
It is. It kind
This
of looks like
painting,
modern art to me. It has
I think so too. Like, you would see
when
this on a cement wall, and it would look like it belongs in the modern day.
and at that time, sort of pre-language, they really were communicating with pictures. And we talked when you and I were talking about this sort of timeline, and we realized that so if someone made a painting in a cave, well, it might be seen by everybody, certainly going to be seen by everyone in the cave, and it's going to be seen by maybe people who come and visit the cave or pass through. But when you think about that compared to the incredible breadth we have of ability to communicate, among millions of people, it's a very different kind of communication. It's very local, and it's
Right.
not very specific.
Right, because they can't just. I mean, if someone from back then just came into a cave and saw this, like, they would see the image, but what does it communicate by itself, right? Uh,
Exactly.
I mean, because I'm looking at it and I can infer, like, I can kind of pick up, like, I can interpret it the way I might interpret any piece of art, but if they were trying to say something, I definitely am not. I'm not sure what that was. I only have guesses.
And the
But
other part about that, building on what you just said, is that it might be different from one cave to the next, or one, big area to the next. So there's no real kind of standardization of the way that we're going to use language to capture what it is we want to say. And
right.
so that obviously changed when we got the alphabet, and when we were able um, to be much more specific about what it is we were communicating.
Now, the one caveat to that is that there was, before there was written language, the only way to retain information was to tell it to each other, and so there was the oral tradition, right? Like
Yes,
like the epic poems of the European world, as well as I think pretty much like myths and oral histories in any tradition. I know there are Native American stories that date back that talked about the ice ages and talked about woolly mammoths, which were around like way before written language was ever invented. And so
that's
uh,
right. Yeah.
we were able to relay information that way, but it still has to be contained in like one localized place in space time. So in one brain, and you can't put it down and make it separate from the flow of time. It has to be a part of an immediate experience. So like
Right.
whatever stories these were a part of, we just like we can't yeah, we just can't know for sure what they were, which I think is kind of sad. Although it does make it even more interesting art, I think, in its own
It
way.
does. It's very abstract. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, then yes, okay. So then uh, we came up with writing things down, and the first things we wrote down, we humans, was this cuneiform language. I think in ancient Sumeria, um, and this was it, I, it wasn't an alphabet because it didn't correspond to sounds, I don't think, or at least not directly to sounds. But each one of these marks had a specific meaning, and so what I find interesting about this is that like the cuneiform tablets from thousands and thousands of years ago. I wish I had a year, but I didn't retain that. The examples that we have, or like the remains of that from that time period, were very kind of mundane sort of records, like economic records of transactions between two merchants, or legal disputes between two people, which aren't exciting when you think about ancient history, except for the fact that if you don't have any sort of way to write those down, you don't have a civilization. Uh, so I don't know. Do you think it's an exaggeration to say that the written language is responsible for civilization?
Do I think that?
Yeah.
Of course, I think I mean, there was civilization before there was written language, but the layers of depth of communication and the layers of culture couldn't have evolved without a more specific way of capturing our human experience about and being able to relay that to other people is very much dependent on having a language that captures. It's really also about capturing the specificity of experience, right? So it's not just pictures, general pictures, but it's trying to relay details and specifics about, you know, the laws and about emotions and about relationships, and all of that had to evolve really after there was language.
That's actually an interesting point you bring up about specificity, because it seems like that's kind of increased over time. And is that the general trend that, like, I wonder how specific it's going to get?
Well, I don't know. In some ways, I feel like we've kind of, and we'll talk about this later, I guess, but I feel like we've kind of gone from specificity to, you know, emojis are not very specific, right? I mean,
that's true.
So
right.
Are we coming full? That's, you know, for the name of the talk, that you know, from campfire to campfire, you know, are we actually, is language evolving in that way, or are we kind of returning to, you know, a more pictorial way of expressing ourselves? I don't know.
It's in related to that. So this was ancient Egyptian language, which was pictographic in nature. So they also didn't have an alphabet until later. But what they had was pictographs that were, you know, they visually demonstrated symbols that were recognizable. So like this one is, you know, this one has two people. This one is obviously an eye. And it stood for something specific, but they used, so they condensed visual information into much more heavily symbolic information, which I guess is what an emoji is.
Yeah, Poplapo, I was just, as you were pointing to those different symbols, I was thinking that it is the case that for when you're representing objects and specific things, specific events, you can do it with individual symbols. But when you start to talk about ideas and things that are more abstract, then it's very difficult to use a pictorial language to do that. You need to have a way to write down and code what it is that you're trying to capture that's not concrete.
You know, but emojis are like that, right? Like, whenever I see someone communicating entirely in emojis, it's very frustrating. I get really upset because I can't figure out what they're like trying to coerce me into assigning like specific meanings in a way that doesn't seem to correspond with how emojis are, because they are more abstract. Like you can use the eggplant emoji, for instance, in a, you know, maybe a couple of different ways. There, you know, there's I feel like they're a little more abstract than they are pictographic. Or what do you think? Can you read emojis when someone just puts emojis down?
Well, I find it frustrating, and once, I mean, it's fine just as a general sort of statement of someone's emotion, but I feel the same way you do. I think it's pretty limiting, and it depends on what your goal is. I mean, if you're just sort of touching base with someone and you don't really want to get into, you know, any kind of a dialogue with them, then it's fine. But the minute you want more specifics and you want to talk about ideas, I think you know, it's impossible to do that using emojis.
So I know that I use emojis kind of more as like decoration. So like I will convey like a mood more than I will try to convey information with emojis.
Right, exactly.
Is that what people do?
Yeah. Some people are stepping up. Do they want to talk, or?
Yeah, we should. Yeah, Dojo, what do you got for us?
I was just going to say, when you were talking about whether or not written word or language helped form civilization, I was thinking about things like the Code of Hammurabi, like an ancient Babylonian stone tablet from like 1700 something BC. So that would probably be
That had,
some
did that
strong
have
evidence for
legal,
that case.
like laws on it? Was that what it was?
Yeah, essentially it laid out different legal situations and even according to caste and what the punishment for different offenses should be and so on.
Right, because like how would you convey that information to a wider population without being able to write it down? Nobody could be expected to obey the law because nobody would know what the law was.
Right,
Seems
and so I think at least the main copy they found was carved on a very large stone.
Hmm.
So, kind of similar to the Rosetta Stone centuries later.
Right, which we've used for translation. Meme Man.
Meme.
So yeah, you were talking about like kind of emojis. I think yeah, for the most part they are used for emotion, but like for decoration, I don't know. I mean, if you're just going to convey a mood, I feel like you should use your words for that. You know, find a good word that helps set the mood. I don't know. Emoji can be good.
but
Can be
like,
good shorthand.
if it's springtime and I'm telling someone I'm gonna go take a walk in the springtime, and then I put a flower and a leaf and a sunshine, you know, I'm conveying information. It's sort of mood information, but it is still just decoration.
But I feel like, you know, I'm gonna go take a walk in the springtime. It's beautiful outside, and you know, fuck, I'm not good with the words, but
well, I'm not either, which is why I want to use emojis.
But you know, I feel like it's you know, you benefit yourself more if you use like more creative words. But you know,
I benefit myself more.
yeah, it like it helps you feel. I don't know. I think you like it helps you feel better about yourself, and it makes you feel good. Like you feel clever that you pulled off that wordplay or something.
But it's an art in itself, right? Like you can feel good if you draw a pretty picture. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. And I think too, some people are more comfortable with words than other people, like you touched on that before. And for people who you know, I think emojis, I mean, it depends on how they're used, but I think it also depends on how comfortable people are using, you know, articulating ideas.
I think so. My mom uses tons and tons of emojis, and the reason she does it is like because she feels like she can't contain, we've talked about this, she can't contain her expressiveness in just words, because in person she's a very energetic, like she is like, she just effuses tons of energy, and she can't capture all that in words, and so she'll say what she needs to say, and I think she does it descriptively, but then she'll still just put tons and tons of emojis, and then I'm able to interpret that as, oh, I'm getting a lot of energy from this. So,
that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, that she does that. She feels the need to do it.
Yeah, well, it's satisfying, right? It expresses something, and obviously with language, one of the things is to be able to express in whatever way feels most accurate, I think.
So I guess getting back to what we talked about before, about how platforms of communication affect the way that you use language, is sort of interesting to VR. And the question is whether or not the fact that we're in VR, as opposed to other ways of communicating, does that present any barriers to our ability to communicate with each other? Does it free us up in certain ways? And that's sort of a question I throw out there.
Yeah. I want to get back to that. Let's move forward for now. Let's see. Next in the timeline. So for a long time we wrote things down. We had ink and pen and wrote letters to each other. But replicating words was much more difficult. So, the previous slide, just to show you. Let's see. Did I click it? I don't know if I did.
Yeah, you clicked it.
Okay,
so that's back to that. Yeah.
Okay, so so this, for example, this is a piece of scripture, and the way that that the church, or maybe a couple churches, they wrote down their scriptures by handwriting them, and they got monks or whoever to handwrite them over and over and over and over again, and they were generally holy books were the only books that were around for a long time because they were generally the only one who had the resources to replicate the written word, until the printing press came along, and people were able to, put out whatever they wanted to very, very swiftly. And I think this reduced, I mean, speaking of like what we're saying to each other, like now we could have newspapers. When you had to write everything by hand, having a newspaper is extremely impractical because you'd have to write something new by hand every single day for however many people. And so people didn't distribute the news. It was all, word of mouth.
And when that
suddenly
happened, when the printing press came about, it was seen as a fairly threatening invention on the part of the church, which had up to that time sort of they had a monopoly.
Yeah.
Basically, is maybe a way to put it, on the written word and on communication, and that gave them, and they perceived it correctly, that gave them a certain amount of control over the message, right? The medium is the message, and they were able to have that control. Once the printing press came out, and and it wasn't controlled centrally, then it did become a threat because you could disseminate different kinds of information more easily.
Right. And I mean, as much as it's a good thing to have written communication proliferated across the world, right? Because we can exchange all sorts of information and become educated and say all sorts of, have all sorts of interesting conversations with each other, that it does make misinformation extremely easy. And now we have fake news, and that's become,
exactly.
we don't even have to print it anymore, right? And that's why, it can just, people just put it out there and other people will just eat it up, and that's the nature of it. So that's kind of interesting in that, like, spreading, when you can spread any idea that you want, then there's no barrier to spreading every idea that you want. So that's kind of an interesting way that things kind of transformed. Oh, I'm getting a message, Meme Man, that your IK is stuck on the stream. You might want to do an emote. Yeah, do an emote, sure. And see if that fixes it.
Am I fixed? I could change avatar.
Did that fix it, Ghoster?
It should be fixed.
Okay, it's fixed.
Sorry about that.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so and on a related note, this is an advertisement. Let's see. To be sold. They were selling sailing ships in this particular advertisement. I ended up not including it, but there was another ad I saw that was from the 1800s that was a ad for cocaine toothache drops. Because things change over time, and so they could just advertise that one. But so now, of course, so both written, like, published works and advertisements have just kind of exploded, but so too have academic works and works of art, and obviously conversations with each other. And although people still wrote letters to each other all the time, because you don't need to have a letter mass printed, and so letter writing is obviously a tradition that.
And when you think about letter writing, and it provided a sort of documentation of people's relationships with each other, particularly the personal relationships with each other. And now, and I think about this, texting and all these, and even email. I mean, they can be saved, things that you say in Discord. I mean, there's so many different platforms. How, at the end of the day, will there be an aggregated way that someone will understand who an individual person is based on all of those platforms and all the ways that they have to say? It's not just tying up a bunch of letters that a person has written over the course of their life. They're scattered. All their communications is scattered in so many different directions that in historical terms, how are people going to look at them, and how will they be remembered? What will be saved from all of that?
That's, yeah, like we exist, in our modern world, we exist on like multiple vectors, right? I was watching a video about artificial intelligence. I posted it on the Deep Thought server, but one of the things it talked about was high dimensionality, which is what happens when things exist in multiple contexts. And so like our social lives exist in a high multidimensional way, where we exist on Discord, we exist in VR chat, we exist on Facebook,
Yes.
we exist in all these different places. And you're right, we present a different, a different like story of ourselves, and a different relationship with others, in each specified context. And
And then at the and then at the end of the day, when we've lived a full life, how does all of that get aggregated and put together to form a memory of that person?
One of my favorite authors, Rudy Rucker, actually talks about, how it's kind of an idea that when someone dies, you can upload their brain to a computer, and then the computer could exist as them. We're nowhere near that type of functionality, but there is like a low res, or like a low tech version of that he proposes, called a life box, which has an artificial intelligence go through and scrape everyone's, when someone dies, scrape their emails, their social media, all their accounts.
That's interesting.
Put it all together and profile them just based on all that information, and from that, like just provide a really sophisticated search engine, for instance, that you could use to kind of interact with that person's history.
One thing about that is that those platforms may not exist indefinitely either.
Oh, that's true too. Yeah, so you have to save that, or it's going to be lost. Like, how many good relationships have you had on Discord? If Discord goes away, like all of the history of your friendships with this person might vanish, and then all you've got left is your memories, which aren't gonna last forever. And so that's I like writing things down, having them be static. Again, like it takes a amount of time. Like, this advertisement became detached from its temporal place as soon as it was printed, and we know that because it exists now. It exists here when it has no context here, but it it has a context in the abstract. It's not serving the same function anymore, and so it removes it from this like continuous flow that is the most, I don't know, like the most natural, I guess.
Does anyone have any thoughts about what we've been talking about so far?
Who wants a life box, or who doesn't want a life box made of them when they're done?
Maybe, but maybe more like a highlight. I think I would prefer a highlight reel.
Highlight reel, yeah, just the good parts, right?
Like, not the good parts, the parts that are like that like show me as best as they can.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it has the best parts. Maybe parts people didn't know about me, as long as it's like encompasses me as I saw it, or as I, as it was.
But like most accurately demonstrate the reality of your personality and your, like, who you were as a person. That makes sense.
Not through what you can do, what you did.
Right. Through your behavior. I like that. Dojo.
So I might ruin this because I'm just an amateur reading about this stuff, but I know in philosophy of language there's a concept called semantic holism. That sort of like you're saying about that ad for the ships. In a way, it's talking about how you can't necessarily understand an expression in a language just isolated from its context. You get the full understanding by being like a native speaker in the context that it was used in originally.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a philosophical problem in trying to translate from one language to another.
I mean, it is also a philosophical problem, I think, in terms of meaning, right? Like, because I mean, if that's the case, then then language doesn't hold meaning. It's not language that holds meaning. It's a person that holds meaning, and they just ascribe it based on, the visual information that happens to hit their eyeballs, but everything that makes up what a language is behind their eyes rather than on the paper.
Yeah, well, like linguists will point out the specific meaning of words or expressions do change over time depending on context as well. So it's
well, we see that in English.
Yeah, so that is pretty true. Like there isn't a true concrete absolute meaning on language itself.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So I wonder too then, back at the cave paintings, maybe those symbols did have a concrete meaning back then. Maybe images, had a more defined, rigid meaning in some way that has since been lost over time.
And even if they did have a specific meaning, when you compare the content of what it is that they could say on a drawing on a wall, there's just no comparison to what we can say and what we can communicate, the level of abstraction, the level of detail.
Yeah. Okay, so progressing in time, we got to electronic forms of communication. The first one being the telegraph, in which you could use Morse code you'd use this device and you'd press down on it, do a long signal for a dash and a short signal for a dot. And then each one of those patterns, corresponded to a character. And there were operators, telegraph operators that you'd bring. You'd write up a little note. You'd give it to them. They'd take the note. They'd translate it into Morse code. They'd send it across the line. The other telegraph operator would get it, and interpret it, figure it, read it, figure out who it was for, and then deliver it in English or whatever language to whoever the recipient was. And now we have computers that essentially do the same thing. The operating system is now the telegraph operator, and it converts words to binary, although in a much more convoluted fashion with many layers in between. But essentially,
yes and no's. Like yeses and no's.
Right, yeah. But and with that, I mean, true and false, off and on. Like those are simple. Those are like I don't know. You call them natural symbols, where like one thing occurs if the thing is true, and the other thing occurs if it's not.
And they're binary.
Anyway,
they're
yeah.
Right. And as we get more digital and electronic in our communication, what I find interesting is that the language itself gets more abstract. Like we went from a wide variety of letters to a very small variety of symbols used to express those letters, and it keeps getting more and more abstract in that way. Like even my voice now communicating with you is getting converted by the software into a series of bytes, which is essentially binary, going across the wire, being translated by your software into the sound of my voice. So not even into a written language, but into a sound, which I think is pretty impressive.
Yes, I agree. And it's, it is binary, and even the if you think about how complicated computers are, it does get down to ones and zeros ultimately. That's all there is. And that's kind of wild to think about too.
Yeah, there's transistors. The transistors are I believe they can each hold a bit of information, or is it a byte? One of the two. Anyway, once they were invented and people were able to pack them into circuit boards, it just enables that thing, true false, extremely rapidly, so fast that we can't even detect it. But it's still just
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, as we move along too down this timeline, it goes from one individual person being able to communicate with another individual person through these, let's say, pictures on the wall, to a many-to-many kind of communication. And that also changed the nature, when you got into mass communication, it changed the nature of the way that we talk to each other too. And I think that the fact that it is mass, that you can disseminate the messages and the information so broadly to so many people simultaneously had a big effect on, I think, and maybe talk about this, has a big effect on what you say. Yeah.
Probably. But the power dynamics of it have shifted. You know, when the newspapers were, had first come out, it was a small, group of journalists distributing to a very vast variety of people, and that was where people got their information. Nowadays, I check Twitter for my news like every morning and talk about a many-to-many communication. Like that's just tons of people talking to tons of people all the time, and that's how I find out about things, and that's where I get my information about what people are thinking and what they're what's going on in the world.
And it also means, like you pointed out, that the control of the message is now disseminated, not just the messages themselves, but who sees what. That used to be limited, a one-to-many kind of thing. We think about, let's say, a newspaper and its readers or whatever. Now it is many-to-many, and the control has been disseminated, and that has changed a lot of the ways in which we find out about the world and communicate with each other.
But I think it also, I think it's a really good thing, but there is a weakness in it, in that it makes it more susceptible to the frailties of human communication, which are things like bias and the way you communicate information, your attitude is going to influence the information that comes across. The way you say something is going to influence the way that I hear it and how I interpret it. And so we've got much more freedom to talk to each other. And at the same time, the information becomes more and more subjectively influenced as we do that. So there's kind of a balancing. I don't know. I think they probably have sort of a balancing effect on each other, but there's probably a direction, like a trajectory for how free that information is.
Anybody have any thoughts about that, or comments?
Am I alone here? Does anybody else use Twitter as their newspaper?
I don't.
I don't think I read the news enough. Like I'm not totally in the social media circle. Like I think only this year I got Facebook, and that was only because I needed it for college.
I tell you what, though, I tried subscribing to an actual newspaper once, and it was miserable. Every single article I read was something bad that happened. Like it was just people being awful to each other, and that was the entirety of the news that I received. It was terrible.
That's interesting. And so you stopped your subscription and didn't.
Yeah.
And you feel like it wasn't balanced in terms of the way the information was being reported.
I don't know if the way I'm doing it now is more balanced, but what I was doing before was reading about all these crimes people were committing and just ways that people were just being awful to each, like horrible things that I don't know. And so like I feel like I don't necessarily need to read about. There are things that I kind of want to inform myself when it comes to the world, and so so this is my bias, where my news sources skew towards. I read more about technology. I read about information security. Like I read about artists. I read about like various, like the types of people I follow definitely have a certain type of information that they put out, and so it's definitely going to be a filter bubble in some ways, but it's a pretty imprecise filter bubble, because things can still, I have no control over what gets in and what doesn't.
Well, here let me throw out this question as we move along, just if anyone wants to tackle it, and that is that are we, because of all these modes that we can communicate in, are we better off in terms of our socializing and our making and keeping friends, do you think? Or has it become more fractured and more difficult to maintain relationships. Anybody have a thought about that?
Yeah, I do. I think
Can you?
yeah, in some
It's
ways
hard
it
for
does.
me to hear you.
Will you
Oh,
come
Go to the
forward?
center.
It does. I
Okay.
think in some ways it does fracture things. Like friends you've maybe had, you want to keep track of, like for a while, you lose. But like in terms of gaining friends, I think you definitely like. It's a lot more. You find somebody, and then you bond online, and it's. Geez, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways it can work.
Yeah.
But it depends on like if you're
Yeah.
transitioning from a real life relationship or are you going from virtual to real life.
And
think it's
talk about that for a minute, the virtual to real life and vice versa.
I mean, like with virtual to real life, I think that you have a lot of weird and random experiences that the internet has probably assisted you with. Like, oh, remember this time I showed you that one meme or whatever. But like once you're like in going from where am I going with this? Going from real life to
Well, I think,
virtual,
yeah.
you have to maybe it's not really about the virtual. You're more trying to set up for real life. And I think a virtual relationship can just become a real life relationship. It's possible, but it always has that like remnant of being virtual in it, I think.
You
I
think
think
so? That it
There's
that's
probably
interesting.
a number of different like
Yeah.
combinations of ways you can do that, right?
Yeah.
Like, be friends with someone mostly in the virtual world, but then you might see
You
them
do
from
know
time
them.
to time in real life.
Yeah. There's
Yeah.
but yeah.
I think in terms
That's
of, I don't know,
interesting.
personally in terms of meaningfulness, I get a lot of meaning out of my virtual friendships because they're not happening by accident. Like they're not I mean in real life, like maybe I'm friendly with my coworkers, but I'm only friendly with them because we happen to end up in the same place together, and it's crucial that we all get along, and so we're all very pleasant to each other. But I can't establish the same kind of sometimes you can, but like I can't establish the same kind of meaningful relationship uh, as with someone that I might meet and then spend time around because I choose to spend time around them or choose to talk with them or write with them or interact with them, not because I just like it's convenient because they are in the same place, but because we are seeking out each other because it's so easy to seek each other out in a virtual
So whether
environment.
whether you're sitting, down with people in a real campfire or it's a virtual campfire and you're surrounding yourself, that it doesn't really matter maybe in the end because you're
and
having the
everyone's going to be
same
different.
social experience. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think it's probably the meaning we assign to it that makes it, it gives it that social impact or not. Like I mean, even in very abstract ways, like some of the most meaningful conversations I've ever had were via long email, like letter writing, just via long email exchanges with another person. Those were still very meaningful interactions, even though our voices weren't involved and my, hand gestures weren't involved, but I was still making a connection with someone else through just the words, through the temporally displaced words.
Interesting. Yeah, VR can kind of become the village green, right? That what
I think
what
so.
used to be called the village green of people to gather just like we're doing now
Yeah,
and
or
having
the
these
town square.
conversations. Yeah, town
Mhm.
square. Mhm. It's almost 11, I think,
Oh, okay,
Eastern
yes.
Standard Time. I just
Just
I want
related
you did
to yeah, we'll finish up.
yeah.
This is just related to that question of when is it meaningful? Are we making progress in our relationships? Because over time we've come up with all these different ways to talk about happiness. Are we really improving the way we talk about happiness? Are we making ourselves happier? I think is the question there.
Any thoughts on that from anybody?
We're wrapping it up. Anybody have any closing thoughts on on this or anything we've talked about?
I mean, there are definitely some like social interactions that are maybe like that have made me happy here, like in VR chat, but it's not just like happiness. I think if like all emotions, perhaps, are
Yeah, it's
kind of
depth
the
of
things.
has meaning,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Jojo, did you have something?
Only really broadly on language in general, if you just want a general reflection.
Yeah.
Sure.
It kind of seems to me like one of the biggest strengths of language for us is we can only really understand a certain complexity of topic, but we can take a very complex concept and then boil it down into a word or a phrase, and then take that and use it to build on a more complex idea, and then crunch that down into a word, and so on. And it gives us a handle to deal with very complex, nested, abstract concepts. And so we begin to have things like the computer systems that bring us here, because we can work with things much more complicated than we could understand as a whole at once.
Yeah, I think that's very powerful. I think we've come a long way. I think the richness of history that we have, even if we're not building in one direction, even if we're still trying to figure out how to be happy, we're building this complex network of language and ideas, and I think it's taking us to good places.
Yes. And
Okay,
we're not really coming full circle in the sense that we're going back to a pictorial way of communicating with each other. I mean, I do feel kind of the same way. I think we're evolving, and at least I'd like to hope we are.
I hope so too. And I guess, I mean, that's sort of why we're here doing this. So thanks everyone for coming.
Before you go, I just have to say something that Pope Lepo and I kind of worked on this together, but Pope Lepo did an amazing job of putting these slides together. We worked on it, but she's the one who had the expertise really to put the screens up and put these images up. And I think she did an absolutely amazing job, and using them in her presentation and incorporating them. I have to say, I think it was just great. And I hope you'll do more of it, because the visuals add so much to the conversation, I think.
Thanks, I hope so.
Well,
do you guys
well
like
done.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like it.
Okay. I think everyone should come up and get a picture. Which picture should we have behind us?
Oh.
Which one do you guys want?
Yeah, we're gonna.
What was that?
This one. This one.
Page. Oh.
No, this one's great. I think this one's great. Yeah. Also, Rubik, I have VR.
Like
Isn't it amazing?
one.
Let's do this one.
Yeah.
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 Welcome.
The stage is off. Good.
Every time I try and jump on stage, I remember.
All right, what do we say? Let's see.
Smile.
Okay, yeah, let's do a bunch of emojis all at once.
Emojis are terrible.
How dare you? We just had a discussion how they're amazing.
Yeah.
Yay!
Emojis are terrible.
You are
Happy
terrible.
emoji! Excellent.
Amazing.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
And with that,
people
wonderful
especially-
folks that are watching the stream and or recording afterwards, we want to thank you for coming to today's show of Endgame.
Bye-bye.
And with
Thank you
that,
for joining us.
Thank you.
go ahead and shut down.